Hi, welcome to Unit 6, Land and Water Use. Let's get going. Today we're going to talk about renewable and non-renewable resources and a thing called the tragedy of the commons. So a resource is basically anything that's useful to people that occurs in nature. So we're talking fossil fuels, mineral resources, fish, trees, fertile land. These are things that are beneficial to people. They are resources. And now those resources then can be looked at in two different ways. They could be either renewable or non-renewable. So a renewable resource is one that you won't run out of. It replenishes itself. All right. So for instance, the sun is always going to shine, the wind is always going to blow. So these are renewable. Then you can say like food. Well, food grows, and so as long as I can keep growing that food, it is a renewable resource. Water keeps coming out of the ground, so I keep getting drinking water. Trees keep growing. Wood is a renewable resource. But it turns out if we use them the wrong way, some of these renewable resources can turn into non-renewable resources. So a non-renewable resource is something that you will run out of, that you don't get more of. It does not replenish itself, at least not in terms of uh, human timeframes. Okay, so like fossil fuels, they got made millions of years ago. We use them up in a century. Once they're gone, they're gone. They might remake themselves, but not in a human time frame. Minerals, they don't remake themselves. They're here. We use them. They're gone. Things like that. So a non-renewable resource does not replenish itself. Once you use it, you lose it. Now, the thing is, some renewable resources, if they're overexploited, they become non-renewable. A classic example would be an aquifer. So let's just say I have an aquifer. It contains 100 million liters of water, and it recharges itself at a rate of 10 million liters per year. Okay, so 10 million liters come in, and 10 million liters flow out of it. It's basically a renewable resource. Now, I put a well in and I pump out 4 million liters a year. Well, 10 million liters come in, I pump out 4 million, 6 million liters flow into the river or lake. Hey, you know what? I can just do this forever. I'll never run out. But then my city grows, or I put in some golf courses and I need more of that water. Well, now I start pumping 15 million liters a year. Well, guess what? It's refreshing or replenishing at 10 million liters a year, but I'm exploiting at a rate of 15 million liters a year. I will run out of it. All right. So each year I have less of it. And over the course of a few years, it's going to be gone. So I turn a renewable resource into a non renewable resource. If I lose soils, I can't grow food anymore. So food should be a renewable resource. It becomes a non-renewable resource. Fish reproduce themselves, but if I overharvest them, then I run out of them. So that's what we need to look at then. So one way of coming to understand why we would turn renewable resources into non-renewable resources is a concept called the tragedy of the commons. And this is an idea that was first described in 1968 by a guy named Garrett Hardin to explain how it is that the human motivation to profit individually is something that works against um, the common good. So here's what he suggested. I'm just going to try to parse it down to the simplest idea. Let's just say that there's a pasture. You know what? I'm going to go to the next one here. I think this one might be better. Okay. So let's just say I have a pasture. This pasture is 40 acres. Okay. It has grass that grows. There's food there. So we have the common areas and it is shared by everyone in a village. Okay. Let's say there's 20 families in the village and each family in the village has a cow. Now that cow provides them with milk that they can have all year. All right. Or at the end of the year, they can slaughter the cow and have the meat and then grow another cow. So the rate at which the grass grows can sustain indefinitely 20 cows as a renewable resource. But what happens is one of those families goes, now hang on a second. What if I put two cows out there? Think how much more money I could have. I could sell all this extra milk. I could sell all this extra meat. Honey, we could be rich. And so they put out, now there's 21 cows. The person next door goes, wait a second. Eric's put out an extra cow. He's, like if he can do it, why don't I get to do it? That's not fair. And now all of a sudden you go, instead of having 20 cows, you got 40 cows out there. Every family does it. And that's what happens. That is human nature. And as a result, they overfeed, they overgraze, the grass is all gone, the dirt washes away, and now everybody starves to death. That is the tragedy of the commons. And it always happens. It is human nature. And there's a way of preventing it, but please understand it always will happen if there's a shared resource. Okay, so the idea is it happens for this reason. Humans are motivated to provide for themselves for personal profit, short-term profit. That is how we operate. That's why we're successful, and it worked fine when there weren't that many of us. But what happens is, if the immediate benefit is mine, but the cost, the problems caused by overuse is shared among everybody. then I'm going to have the tragedy of the commons. So since the harmful effects are shared by everyone and the benefit is just gained by me personally by doing the harm, I'm going to do it. And the only way to prevent it from happening is having a governmental agency step in and regulate the resource. That's the only way it can be done. Now, there's a couple ways the government can do that, but understand, without the government, you will always end up having humans overexploit a shared resource. So let's look at a couple examples. An aquifer. So the Ogallala aquifer of the Midwest of the United States, it does not recharge that fast. It provides lots of water. It allowed America to become a rich country because they could sell all this grain to all over the world. But at the rate at which it's being overused, it will run out within a couple decades, and then these farms are just going to collapse. The same thing's happening in China and many other places. So aquifers are a shared resource that often get overexploited. Another one is fisheries, which we'll talk about in another screencast today. The Grand Banks fishery is an example of this. So off the coast in the North Atlantic, off the coast of Newfoundland, there was an amazing cod fishery. It was very profitable for many, many, many years. And then new technologies came along that allowed people to overharvest. So suddenly the harvest screamed upwards, and people got really rich for just a few years, and then they basically had no fish left to reproduce, and now there's no fish there at all. Okay, so the short-term profit for a few companies for a few years, and then everyone else is out of fish forever. And then you could also make the argument that pollution is an example of this, because you have corporations that basically dump pollution, say, into the air or into the waterways, and they maximize their profits by not paying for the pollution that they put out there. And so if they're allowed to just put that pollution out there, everyone in the environment pays the price for their pollution, but they profited by making the pollution, right? And so if they're not somehow forced to uh, be brought to terms for this, they are always going to say, "Look, I am going to maximize my profit. That's what my motivation is, and if I can share the problem with the whole world, great. That way is the whole world is paying for it for multiple generations, and that's exactly what led to global warming. Now, the tragedy of the commons basically is something that is caused when there is a shared resource, but it tends not to occur when there is a privately held resource. So people don't tend to overexploit something that's their own because they realize, well, if I lose it, I won't have it in the future. And so one way of getting people to not engage in tragedy of the common behaviors, ironically, is for the government to lease out or give ownership or partial ownership or exclusive rights to resources to individuals or corporations, because they tend to take care of it when they know that it's theirs, and therefore they're not going to, they will be the one who pays the price if they overexploit. When that happens, they don't overexploit. So let's look at a couple ways that we can have the government do this. So the government can basically oversee the management of a resource, and this definitely has worked great in the United States in a couple ways. So the National Forest Service basically says, "Hey, look, you can have access to this forest, but you got to use it in a way that's sustainable, and we're going to check on you and make sure that you do that. You can make your profits, but you can't overexploit. Otherwise, we take away your right to harvest these resources." Another thing is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Resource Services. They monitor the populations of fish species in the oceans: salmon, halibut, cod, whatever, right? And they basically set target limits for this is how many you can take sustainably. They monitor the population, they set limits, and they monitor the boats to make sure we're not over harvesting. And once that maximum sustainable yield gets reached, they shut down the fishery for the season. And by doing this, those fisheries are sustainable indefinitely. They took a resource that should be a renewable resource, and they keep it a renewable resource by oversight. But another way you can do it is by turning over the ownership of certain areas to certain corporations. If you say to a corporation, "You have exclusive fishing rights in this area. This is your area to fish," you know what? They're not going to overfish it, because they realize if they do, they won't have any money to make in the future. So they will care for it. Same thing with forests, with any kind of resource you can think of. So there's two different ways: having the government oversee it completely, or having the government uh, let certain organizations have ownership rights, so that they will then see that the preservation of that resource is in their own self-interest. Okay, so that's natural resources and the tragedy of the commons. Thanks for watching.